does 80s horror mean to me? Well, I'm an 80s born baby, and I grew up loving horror films, so I saw plenty from the 80s. So there's a lot of nostalgia for me with 80s horror. Also, I think 80s horror was a little bit different than when we get today. There was a real cool retro style, and there was quite a lot of blood and controversial moments. Although in recent times, there is more blood appearing on screen, and the BBFC and the rating boards have become a little bit more lenient. But when I think of 80s, at the time, it was forbidden fruit, extreme cinema, horror, gore, and all of that. So I will say I'm full of nostalgia for it, but we got some really cool 80s iconic horror villains that are still knocking around today. And so it was a bit of an inspiration for me as an independent filmmaker, and it kind of opened the wider world to my love of cinema. 80s horror was really an introductory piece for me to pursue film and pursue film viewing, film collecting, filmmaking. So Slumber Party Massacre from 1982, that's a really bad film, but I really love it. It's really cringy. It's bad performances, bad acting, gratuitous nudity, which is great, very sleazy, very silly, very basic concept. Now, really, there's a lot of bad things put into the mixer here, but it is such a entertaining, funny, so bad it's funny film. Now, I loved it because it entertained me. Although I was like, what is this? I was entertained. I wanted to carry on watching it. And it kind of made me feel like I want to go and make a horror film like that. I can go and do something cheesy like that. So, you know, it was a great piece. I still love it. It's fantastic to see it come out on 4K now in a really nice edition, which I obviously picked up on release day. And I still think it's better than the two sequels that followed, the first bad 80s version of that film. My definition of a bad horror film, a bad 80s horror film, or bad film in general, you know, if it's a weak story, if it's bad performances, you know, bad effects, bad editing, bad cinematography, if things are bad. But what you find is a lot of these 80s bad horror films do have a number of these things. They are all badly put together in a way. Now that is partly to do with budget. I understand that. Making films is very hard. Now, for someone who's made some crap films themselves, I do find it hard to be judgmental on film, because I know what goes into a film. I know how easy it is for something to go wrong or turn out a disaster. But sometimes some of these films have got not bad budgets, budgets I wouldn't mind having sometimes, but they were shot on celluloid film, so you're working with a whole different medium. And I've done some films on film, and again, that's a lot more pressure than today's digital filmmaking. It's a lot harder, more of a craftsmanship. So I respect the craftsmanship that goes into that. However, there is still some questionable bad stuff, but I love. So like Crash Zooms that Jess Franco did, which was before the 80s, but it went through the 80s. It's a technique that I've seen pop up a few times, which I love, and I've tried to homage. What I find interesting is a few years ago, a decade ago, there was a resurgence, and filmmakers were trying to capture that golden time of horror film from the 80s, and they were making films try to look like they were from them, or recreate it with grading, trashing them. And it's interesting that they were doing that, and they never quite landed as well as a true 80s film. They couldn't capture that atmosphere because they are products of their time, and as much as you try, I think it's just hard and almost impossible to recapture all these elements that made it, because they weren't trying to make it like that. It kind of is just how it was. It was a fashion thing. It was a trend. It was a product of its time. And so you're not trying to do it when you did it back then. You are just making a horror film in the 80s, whereas you're trying to do it now, then it just doesn't land as well. So I find that interesting. But to be honest, bad makes good when it comes to 80s bad movies. So at the end of the 80s, 1989, along came The Horror Show, as it's known, but in the UK known as House 3, cashing in on the previous two films, House and House 2. Now, House 3 was very different. Now, I was given a list of films to talk about, and House 3 is the one that stands out to me, because I loved House 1 and 2. They were really funny, comedy, you know, comedy horror, very light-hearted comedy. But I do love my dark, nasty horror films. And I went to a car boot sale and I brought House 3 on VHS, an ex-rental big box. Came home and put it in, and I was quite young when I did this, and on came House 3, the horror story, and it had a completely different tone. It was really strong horror, it was nasty, it was violent, and I loved it. I was like sitting there going, no, this is a house film. You know, that sums the 80s up really, cashing in on stuff. A film cashing in on two films that have nothing to do with it. It doesn't really have much to do with a house in a way, more an electric chair. But I really enjoyed it. It stood out. It was impactful. Now again, I'm going down that old route of nostalgia. I have obviously a nostalgic connection to House 3, but it was great because it ticked a lot of boxes when you think of 80s horror, which is blood, violence, gore, a little bit of cheesy horror, but dark, moody. You know, it really summed up the era, and it was the end of an era as well, before we got into what I think is more of a crap decade of cinema, the 90s. Don't get me wrong, some great gems come out of the 90s, but it wasn't, for me, the best decade of cinema. I think the 80s was stronger, especially for horror. That might have partly to do with me being in the UK and the BBFC interfering and the whole censorship scandal, because we was at the end of the video nasty era. But still, House 3 is up there for me as a great 80s, I think, good film. You could say bad for various reasons, as I've discussed already, but a great one. If you've not seen it, I highly recommend you check that out.